Hello, everybody. Hello, Victoria and Scott. Hello, Jeannie again. Thanks for joining us here. My name is Jimmy. This is the Veganic Growers Hour number 4. We've been live every 2 weeks since the 3rd of February. So thank you for coming and joining us. Here in Boileau, Quebec, which is west of Montreal, 1 hour and 45 minutes, it is a very balmy for now, 9 degrees Celsius or 48 Fahrenheit. We still have about 45 centimeters of snow on the ground, about 18 inches as I look outside, but it's melting. The maple sap is running. The red-winged blackbirds are singing. They've migrated up, and we are sensing spring, that is sure. So very, very exciting. We actually started in the greenhouse yesterday, planting our onion seeds, green onion seeds, leek seeds, artichokes seeds, and garlic chives. For those of you that are new and that are out there today, we are a small veganic farm, small scale. And yeah, so that's a little bit about us. Some housekeeping, if you're new with us tonight, you can always look back at all the old YouTube shows. They are still available on my Facebook page. So if you're not my Facebook friend, send a request. It's the Facebook is Jimmy Videle. YouTube, the account is Jimmy Videle Veganic Grower, and you can check. Everything is available for everyone. It's public, so you can go ahead and check any of the last 3 episodes if you wish to watch them. So let's get to it. We have a busy show. There's a lot to talk about, so let's go. So tonight we're discussing land and soil of the growing space, garden preparation, and all about veganic compost. So to start, we're going to start with land and soil of the growing space. Before we even talk about where we're going to actually have our garden spaces and what we're going to think about, it is important as veganic growers to think about that we are trying to design space for human food, but it is equally as important to leave a vast amount wild or rewild for all beings to share. When considering our own gardens, care must be taken to site them appropriately. So we do want to take some of the land and provide food for ourselves. It's extremely important that we do this. It's something that if we have the ability to do so, we should be growing our own food. But when we do that, we do want to ensure that we are leaving enough space for all the wild creatures that have lived here before us, a lot longer than we have. And this can be anyone in the floral and faunal realm. It can be the plants, it can be the animals, the insects, the birds. We need to make sure that they are well taken care of as well. And there's a good formula, or a formula that I like to use. So if you have a garden space, it doesn't really matter where it is, whether it's an urban backyard or a rural farmyard, you want to look at it as 25% of your growing space is left just for all other beings. So that can be in the form of flowers, of cover crops, of bushes, anything that gives flowers and seeds, or a lot of organic matter so the little creatures can run around underneath. If you look at your gardening system in this way, then I really believe that you're providing ample space with that 25% extra, or 25% of your gardening space for that. Let me just say hello to everybody. Toronto Vegetarian Food Bank, hello again. Thank you, Anne. How are you? Good to see you again. Jude in Napierville, good to see you. And Regenerative Designs Australia, Justin. All right, cool. Thanks for joining us. First time. We also have Victoria and Scott from Spokane, and Jeannie from Calgary with us again. So thank you all for coming in. So yeah, so we want to look at all of our gardening systems so that we are taking care of the wild creatures that live here, both floral and faunal. Something to also think about if we're looking at, say, this big phrase that we're all probably very concerned about, climate change, but in the sense of carbon sequestration, the amount of carbon that we can actually sequester in terrestrial environments or oceanic environments. A couple of stats I have for you are that in the terrestrial realm, forests sequester, so these are all the forests in the world, they'll sequester 39% of the terrestrial carbon, while wild grasslands will sequester 34%. Now, I'm going to get into this more in just about 4 or 5 minutes about soil organic matter and soil carbon, but keep those numbers in mind. So if a forest, and we're talking the Amazon or way up here in the Northern Boreal forest or forests of Australia, we know that they sequester 39% of the terrestrial stock of carbon, whereas wild grasslands sequester 34%. So they're extremely, extremely important. And when we design our gardening systems, if we look at it from the sort of wild grassland or even a wild forest perspective, either way, then we are going to attempt to also sequester those same percentages of carbon. There you go. So when we're looking at our land, and this can be, let's first look at, say, if you live in an urban environment. So really 100% of the time, having a gardening system, a veganic gardening system, is going to improve the diversity and the biodiversity of any urban situation. So whether it's a front yard, backyard, grassland park system, or just a lot, vacant lot, the veganic gardening system is going to provide more diversity and biodiversity. So you will never have a problem. 100% of the time, start your garden there and you're going to do better for the place that you live. Now, if we're talking rural farmyard, this is a little bit more touchy, a little bit more tricky, because again, we know that wild grasslands sequester 34% of the terrestrial carbon stock. So we don't want to start ripping up wild grasslands just to put in a garden. If that is our situation, and we don't need to do this, but let's just say we happen to purchase a piece of property and it has this kind of native environment, the best thing that you can do is observe your land. There is always parts of the land anywhere that you live rurally that are a little bit less diverse than others. And there may be many reasons for that. The former owners could have tilled it up somehow, damaged the soil. There could have been a former home site. There could have been, like what happened here. The former owner, where we put the garden spot, he dredged up the top 12 inches of topsoil and he sold it off so that he could make the road to the house. So even though when I put my hand into the soil the first time, it was very sandy and I was like, oh, this is great soil. I only realized after we bought our place that when my neighbor came down and told me that the old neighbor had done this. So we lost that 12 inches. So anyway, so there you go. So something to think about when we're looking at our gardening systems. Places that definitely can be improved would be any kind of former agricultural area, especially if it was monoculture. So if it was any kind of corn crop or soy crop or wheat crop and it was just one crop, then that is something that can be definitely improved 100%. But even wherever you live in the rural countryside, if you find those places that happen to have less diversity, then those are the places that we want to choose. It's just more observation, just sort of some food for thought, that we don't want to be going ahead and ripping up native grassland thinking that we're doing good just because we want to grow some food, when in actuality we're probably doing just a little bit more harm than good. Not to dissuade you, just something to think about. So as we're looking at the land, we want to look at the slope. And here in the northern climate specifically, and most of us, other than Australia, which is in there, let's see, we're going into spring, so they're going into fall down there. When we're looking at our slopes and garden on any slope that I have on the land that is going down to the south, so from the north to the south. And the reason why that is when the earth revolves around the sun and sort of spins around herself, she's going to collect as much sun as she can, being in that south direction. So if you have it a little slightly southeast or a little slightly southwest, it's fine. It doesn't have to be a deep, like 4 or 5% slope. I mean, it can be gentle. It's fine. And even if it's flat, it's fine. Now, in the north, if we have something that it slopes down to the north, chances are pretty good that what's going to happen is you're going to have cold pockets, a lot of cold pockets. So you're going to get your early freezes. You're going to get your late freezes in the spring. It would be better if you found yourself a place that sloped down to the south. Now, if for whatever reason that's all you have, that's all you have, and that's great. So continuing on. Now, if you're a little further south, so if you're in, say, somewhere in the United States, you can have your gardens now sloping down to the north, and it'll be okay. But what I observed when I had my garden in Arizona, which was in the mountains of Arizona, which was quite warm, when I did have it going, and the land that we had just happened to slope down to the north, we did get that late freeze that I'm talking about. So it still didn't freeze until later into October, but there you go. So try to understand your land. Best thing to do is to walk it, to feel what you feel, to understand if there's things like microclimates. So when we walk down from our land onto the road, we feel the cold air. We're surrounded by mountains here. So at the bottom of our fields, the main road that goes below our house, it's always cold there because it faces the north slope. So there you go. You don't want to put your garden right there either. So things to think about. Drainage. Where does the water pool on your property? Don't put your garden where the water pools if you can. Now, you're going to have situations where you may not have a lot of choice. You might be limited in space. This show is not specifically for people that are in there, just have a backyard or have up to an acre. It can be at any size. But these are all just things to think about when you're building your gardens, because once you build them, and we're going to talk about garden preparation, once you build them, you don't want to move them. So try to really do the work the first time when you're thinking about where you're going to put your garden space. And sun, extremely important. At least 6 hours a day, up to 12, 14 hours a day is not too much for almost everything. Every vegetable, fruit, and herb crop really does like as much sun as you can give it. So the more sun, the better. I know sometimes you're surrounded by trees. There are other shade-loving crops that we're going to talk about in later shows. But for the most part, the sunnier location, the better everything is going to be. Everything is going to grow. So when we think about the land, every land is going to have a specific kind of soil type. And even though I am a firm believer in the fact that you can grow pretty much everything in every soil type, every single soil type has its slight different characteristics and personality. So we want to make sure that we aren't doing certain things to certain kinds of soils. So the main types of soils are going to be sand, silt, and clay. And the best possible way to determine whether you have sand, silt, or clay, and silt is like a sand, but it has clay particles in it. That's not right. Has particles that are a little bit smaller than sand particles. So it's kind of in between the two. So if you're looking at trying to figure out either kind of soil type, the best thing to do, and the Regenerative Designs Australia said soil jar test is super easy. Yeah, there you go. You can do that. Mine, because I really like to touch my soil, is you take a handful of wet soil and make it into a ball, squeeze your fist, and if you open it and it starts to crumble away, you have sandy soil. And if it stays into a nice ball, pretty much have a more clay soil. It's not a soil test, but it gives you a pretty good idea of what you have. And that's really what you're looking for here. There's also things that can be in your soil that can change the characteristics also. One is peat. Here we have a sandy or a silty loam peaty soil. And because we're kind of north in Canada, we just happen to have actual peat moss in our soil. So it acts very peaty. It's very highly water retentive. There can be chalk soil, which is high in calcium carbonate, which kind of makes your soil look a little grayish. And then there's the best of all worlds, which is loam. And a loamy soil is going to be a mix of, it can be a mix of sand and clay, it can be a mix of sand, silt, and clay, it can be a mix of silt and clay. So there you go. So a loamy soil is going to have the best of all worlds because it's going to be able to have all the characteristics of sand, all the characteristics of silt, characteristics of clay. And what are those? So a sandy soil is going to be very, very well draining, but it's not going to hold nutrients exceptionally well. So you might have you're going to want to build that kind of soil up with compost. Try to build up the organic matter as much as you can because you're going to need some water retention as you can. However, like I said, I mean, there's some crops that prefer sandy soils. Root crops tend to do very well in sandy soils. I've had really good experience growing carrots and beets and onions and potatoes, but then even things like tomatoes and peppers can do very, very well in a warm sandy soil, because that's the other thing. Sandy soil warms up really, really fast. A clay soil is going to be on the other end expected. It's going to hold nutrients very well, but it's also going to hold a lot of water. So the key with a clay soil, and like I said, if you squeeze it, make a ball, and it stays that way, or use the jar test and figure out if you have yourself a clay soil, then you are going to want to make sure that you don't work your soil too much. Anytime that you work a wet clay soil, there is a very real possibility of what you're going to end up happening is a brick. And there's a weird myth out there that if you have a clay soil, go ahead and mix some sand with it. Well, if you've ever mixed concrete and you mix in a little sand into your concrete mix, you just get a nice thicker concrete. So you don't do that. The best thing that you can do, even with that soil, is to go ahead and bring more organic matter also. Compost is always good, and we're going to talk about veganic compost, but you can also mix in straw, you can mix in hay, dried hay, you can mix in dried leaves, you can make in chipped branch wood, and this will just help break up that clay, bind it with that dry material, and you're going to have something more workable. But again, you can plant in that. I've had excellent luck growing potatoes a couple of years ago. My most clay field in a place that doesn't drain well, like I said, watch your drainage, that doesn't drain well, I planted my potatoes, had my best potato crop ever, because clay soils, they go ahead and have a nice abundance of nutrients. They're not always available to the plant, but they have a nice mix of nutrients usually. A silty soil is usually brought upon by, here it's because we live in an old glacial valley. So when the glacier melted, the water ran down from the glacier, pooled here, and then when the pool went by, then it's the sediment. So where you're going to find that kind of soil is in a glacial valley. You're also going to find it in a river valley. A river that floods and then recedes, you're going to find yourself with a silty soil. So there you go. Those are the things. Extremely important, no matter what soil you have. Probably the most important tip I can give you tonight is your pH. It's the power of hydrogen. Vegetable crops, fruiting crops, herb crops, vegetable crops, they really want to be in a pH between 5.8 and about 7.2. And you do this by getting a soil test. There is also a strip test that you can do. I find them to be less accurate, but you can go ahead and use that if you like. If you're really serious about gardening and growing your own food, I would recommend a soil test, and I'm going to tell that a little bit more why. But your pH. So if you can make sure that your pH is in between 5.8 and 7.2, you won't have any problems with most crops. Some are a little fussier. Some brassicas like to be more around 6.2, 6.5, but my soil pH right now is about 5.9, and I really don't have problems growing anything. So that's what you're shooting for, and it's very important. Now, if you're below that, and I've never farmed above that, so I don't know what problems I would have above that. But if you're ever below that, below 5.5, let's say, that is what's considered, well, below 7 is what's considered an acidic soil. And anything above 7 is considered an alkaline soil. So if you are below 7, and then you're an acidic soil. And if you're below 5.5, what ends up happening is in every soil, usually doesn't do anything. It's kind of just there, and the plants use it as they wish. Most of the time, they don't use it at all. It just exists as an element in the soil. But if you do have aluminum in your soil, if you do have a pH below 5.5 and you plant your crops, the aluminum is going to become the majority element. And your plant's roots are going to go down, they're going to touch that aluminum, and the plant's not going to grow. And that's how I knew how to take a soil test, which we're going to talk about right now. That's how I knew I needed to take a soil test back in 2016 when I was planting my tomato and pepper plants, my eggplants, and all of a sudden they were just sitting there doing nothing, eventually turning yellow. Didn't really die, but still didn't do anything. And eventually they did die after 6 weeks of sitting there. It was because I didn't take a soil test, which was not very intelligent on me, but because I'm a farmer. So I really should have before. So is a soil test necessary, and why not? Yeah, absolutely. And especially for your soil pH. I think it's exceptionally important to find that out, as well as your soil organic matter. So you know what you're starting with. Most agricultural soils are between 2 and 7% organic matter. So if your baby plants are going to have the sort of the necessary nitrogen they're going to need to grow. But soil organic matter also corresponds with soil organic carbon. 56 to 60% of soil organic matter is soil organic carbon. And soil organic carbon is actually what will help sequestrate the carbon from the air. So if you have a high soil organic matter, say 8%, 5%, and your soil carbon is 60% of that, so you're at 3%, well, then there is a formula to use that's how much carbon then your fields will sequester, which is pretty cool. So if you raise your soil organic matter, then you're raising your soil organic carbon, and you will then be able to raise your carbon sequestration. I find this very cool. So that is the land and soil portion. As I'm speaking about different topics, don't hesitate to ask. But since there are none, we're going to continue to garden preparation. And we're going to look at this as first-time gardens and already established. If it's a first-time garden and you're looking out into your field and what you see are what some people call weeds, I like to call them native flora because they were here first. You're going to try to figure out how to remove them to plant your garden, because you can't just start your garden in native flora. So let's say we're talking about clover or couch grass or bindweed or lamb's quarters or wild sorrel or yarrow. It's impossible to just plant your plants in there and get them to thrive, because all of these native flora are perennial. And they have lived there for who knows how many eons. And every year they're going to die back. And every spring they're going to push. And they're going to push with so much intensity because they're ready and they know the soil, that your little seedlings, or especially your seeds, are going to struggle. So if it's a very first time garden, you're going to need to remove whatever native flora that you want to remove. Or whatever native flora of the garden space that you have, you're going to want to remove. There are ways to do this. There are other methods. There is there is a hay method that you can use, where you just keep piling hay, and it's called the Ruth Stout method, and I will talk about that in a minute, sort of the pros and cons. We actually have questions on that. But if it's a first-time garden, here is my favorite thing in my 25 years of growing food for myself. Here's my favorite thing to do. Find a reclaimed piece of black plastic, just black, not clear, not white, and place it on the bed, the place that you want to grow, and leave it there for 3 to 4 weeks. It's not permanent mulch. It's a It's a plastic mulch, and I know people are averse to plastics. I'm averse to plastic. One day, all plastic products will stop being made except from recycled ocean plastic. That's my plug to the recycled industry. Go fish all the plastic out of the oceans and make our plastics with that and stop making virgin plastic. Thank you. So anyway, you're going to want to go ahead and put that black plastic down. And you put that for 3 or 4 weeks. What's going to happen is the sun's going to penetrate and it's going to warm the soil greatly. And everything underneath it is going to start decomposing. It's almost after 4 weeks, especially if it's in May, June, it's going to completely decompose. Once you go ahead and take that black plastic off, more than likely what you're going to see is kind of some burnt, dried material, which is great. So with a rake, you just kind of pull out that dried material. Now, the perennial weeds are not dead. You didn't kill them. They're still there. And if you look at my Facebook posts, and what it is a 4-prong cultivator. And you can just go in to your garden space. They have them with a hand, but this one's a standing up one. And you can just start kind of pulling out the big root systems. And when you're talking about clover and you're talking about yarrow, and especially when you're talking about things like couchgrass and bindweed, you're talking about huge mats of root systems. And even couchgrass can be long. The roots can be somewhere from 4 to 5 feet, 1.5 meters long. So if you don't take them out, then they are going to grow back, and they're going to grow back faster than your seeds, and they're going to grow back faster than your seedlings. So what do you do with all that? Well, what I like to do with it is when I take them out, I kind of make a pile over out of my garden bed, and I just put it into a wild section of my place, and then it continues to expand. I don't mind it there. I just don't want it to compete with the food that we're trying to grow. Because we won't win. We just absolutely will not win. And it's not a battle either. It's just about sort of relocating the native flora. They're everywhere here. So we're just relocating a little bit so we can have a little space to grow our own food. At least that's my justification for it. So actually, after you selected your site and you put that black plastic down and you've started doing that, you're going to want to kind of dimension out your beds, whatever size you want. The only thing I would suggest, you can make them whatever length you want. I don't really like beds longer than 100 feet. I find them to be way too long. And if I can't really see the other side all that well, then I'm like, oh man, it's too long. Especially when I was working on other farms about 7 or 8 years ago. But it's more about the width. And what I have figured out for me is that 30-inch width to 3-foot width allows you to, from either side of the bed, be able to reach to the middle easily. So you're not trying too much, trying hard too much, you're not stretching too much. A 4-foot bed, some people can do it if you have longer arms. A 5-foot bed is really too long. You're going to have to step in your beds. And once you make and create your beds, however you create them, I'm going to answer this question. Sorry, the question. See, the microorganisms all live not say 6 inches or 15 centimeters of soil. Now, if the root systems of the perennials are deeper, they'll be there, but the largest and highest concentration of soil microorganisms are going to be in that top layer. So if you take out the sod, then you're taking out all the vast majority of microorganisms that are there. Whereas if you're just kind of digging up, and I will talk a little bit about tillage here in a minute. If you're kind of just digging out the root systems, and when we do that, we take out the root systems and we knock off the dirt. It really doesn't take very long to do this. Then you're leaving most of the soil organisms where they are, except for the ones that are clinging to the roots. So that would be why you would kind of want to do that instead, because heat doesn't, it might kill some of the soil organisms, but the ones a little further down are not going to be completely solarized. And we're not talking for months here. We're only talking for a few weeks. So it's you can remove the sod, and that actually is another option. But again, you're going to be transporting those soil microorganisms that you really are going to want in your soil to a different place. You're also going to probably do more damage to the fungal network that's in your soil as well if you go ahead and take the sod out, as opposed to trying to incorporate. Brings up the idea of tillage. Now, I don't like tractors. I've used them before. I've used tractor implements before. I've created my garden spaces with them before. I've worked on large farms where I've used them before. I just find them, no matter what the soil type, they're just too heavy. And even though the plow is behind and the tires are in front, I just find tractors way too heavy. They compact the soil, they compress the soil. I don't find them good. Now, tilling. If you need to rototill, and this would be the time that you would do that. If you put the black plastic down and you solarize the soil, and you're getting those root systems, you were trying to get some of those root systems out, you can till. Now, that will damage the fungal network also, but from my experience, it seems to damage the microorganism populations a little bit less than if you remove the soil. It's not great to do that, but sometimes, again, if we're trying to create our garden spaces, we need to create the space where we can work. So go ahead, if you think that you have a big mass concentration of native flora root systems in your beds, go ahead and rent a rototiller and do it the first time. Key. However you decide to do it, whether you decide to remove the sod, whether you decide to rototill, whether you decide to just take the 4-tine cultivator and pull out the root systems, what you want to do is create permanent beds. So you're really only going to do this entire process once. You're going to create your bed, you're going to create your pathway, and when you create your pathway, you're going to scoop. You would consider scooping your dirt and putting it on your bed, doing it on all the sides as you go, whatever your beds are. Your paths can be whatever size you want, whatever you feel comfortable walking through. It can be 12 inches or 30 centimeters. It can be 15 inches, 40 centimeters. It really can be whatever you want it to be. Then you will never have this sort of issue of, well, if you're smart, walking in your beds. And your beds are already created. And then what you can do, because usually why people decide to use tractors is that it will dig open the soil very, very deeply. And by doing it extremely deeply, you get a lot, well, at least initially, you're going to get a lot of water movement, a lot of water drainage. But what I think is better is if you build up your beds and you create more cubic footage that way, going higher up, then your plants are also going to, your soil is also going to be well draining. It's also going to make more space for your plants to grow. So anyway, give it a shot, whatever you think is best. But this is just what I would recommend from my time. This is the way to start. If you're opposed to using plastic, you don't need to. You can use like a hay mulch system. And as I'm talking about this, I'm going to bring up there was a general question on the Facebook groups that I'm on about hay mulch, for or against, what would you do? And I live up here in the north. If I put hay mulch down at a time when it's cold, the ground stays very, very cold. I don't have slug problems, but I have read from people from the UK that if they use hay mulch, they get more slug problems. If you live in a place where it's very, very wet, your soils can stay very, very wet, which means that you might have less nutrient uptake. Saying that, if you live in a dry place, and I didn't do this on my farm in Arizona back in 2004 to 2009, but if I did think about it, I probably would. I did use hay. I used alfalfa hay to fertilize my fields, but I think I would, because there in the dry soils, what you're trying to do is create more moisture retention, and the sandy soil too. So I'm trying to create more moisture retention. I want to water less as possible, and the hay is going to do that. So if you're adverse to plastic, if you're averse to rototiller, if you're averse of taking out the sod, if you're adverse to that, then you can try the hay mulch system. I can't guarantee you're not going to have any problems. This is why I don't really promote it, because I also think that there's a specific grass called couch grass, extremely pervasive. It seems to me like people that do hay mulching have it, and if you have it, you continue to use it. It might get more pervasive. And unfortunately, I've seen other people that have used this message only, didn't really weed, thinking they didn't have to, using the Ruth Stout method, which was the no work garden, and they had to weed, or the weeds just got so bad, because sometimes when you buy the hay, it has weed seeds in or native flora seeds in, and then it just takes over. And if you're not ready for it, not ready for it. Me, I think the best case, and this is going to go on to the next part of an already established garden. For me, I think the best is to try to do what you can to get rid of the native flora originally, and then afterwards, just manage it. And what I do find after 6 years of doing it this way, and I do use the black plastic mulch also on fields that for us, we're a half an acre farm. It's just my wife and I that work here. So sometimes we need some help removing that native flora. And what we'll do is we'll use the black cover to help us do that, the black tarp to help us do that. So we'll use that sort of as an extra employee to help us with our weeding pressures, our native flora pressures. I lost my train of thought. Anyway, so we'll go ahead and use it again, but you don't have to. If you just manage your beds, you can let the paths grow up if you want, or you can mulch your paths as high as you want with whatever you want, whether it's chipped branch wood or hay or straw. I mean, you can pile, or dried leaves, you can pile it up as high as you want. You're walking in it, so it doesn't matter. You could probably suppress the weeds that way. But in the garden beds, I think, at least initially, especially when you're planting your little seedlings and when you're planting your little seeds, you're going to want to try to get a little bit ahead by removing those native flora out of the gardens. Once your winter squash start running everywhere, your tomatoes are vining, or your brassicas are huge, even your carrots have their nice canopy. If you get some weeds in there, or your beans, at that point, it doesn't matter anymore. It just becomes part of the compost that's going to compost on the bed, which we're going to talk about in later shows, in bed composting. So there you go. My advice on starting beds. Now, if it's already established, the secret, and you should do this in your initial garden preparation too, but the secret is veganic compost. Actually, I'm going to tell you how we make it. And if you can't make it, try to procure it as best as you can. But if you already have an established garden, observe what's going on with your garden. If you like the setup of the way it is, if you like the way the beds are, if they're permanent, then you're fine, leave them. But it's also based on what you're planting. So if I'm planting, say, pea seeds, and I notice there's quite a bit of organic matter left over there from the spring, because we leave all of our plants to die on our beds every fall, and then the snowpack comes and it stays there and it decomposes, and it's food for the soil microorganisms. And then in the spring we want to plant, well, I might just need to remove some of the straw just a little bit, but it can stay pretty full of kind of rough materials, raw materials, I guess, or pieces of straw, or pieces of wood chip, or pieces of old plant. It doesn't matter, because pea seeds are quite big and they're quite vigorous. You can just plant right in between. Same with transplants. If there's still some plant detritus in your beds, you can leave it if you like, if that makes sense to you. Certain seeds are a little different. If you're planting lettuces, if you're planting carrots, if you're planting beets from seed, if you're planting green onions from seed, sometimes you really want to have a nice, flat, native flora-free bed with not a lot of organic matter on the top. So that, and again, I'm talking about the plant materials that haven't broken down, or the cover crops that haven't broken down. And you might need to remove all that just to go ahead and replant everything. And it's fine if you need to take a rake and remove out that straw, or that brown carbonous material. You can go ahead and put it on your potatoes, or you can put it underneath your winter squash, or your zucchini, or your cucumbers. it doesn't matter. You're still going to use it. You might just need to take it around from there just to go ahead and plant your beds. So if you already have an established garden, and like we do every year, we look at every bed. We have 12 gardens. So we have 160 50-foot garden beds. We look at every bed as individuals. And when we're going to plant, we look at that bed and we say, okay, we're going to put a 50-foot row of carrots. What do we need to do to this bed? Or we're going to put a 50-foot row of snow peas. What do we need to do to this bed? The secret to my process, the secret to what I believe is really important in veganic gardening is veganic compost. And for every bed that would want veganic compost, and not every bed does, like for the peas, we don't put any more compost because they don't seem to require it. Bush beans also, we're just using the soil that's already there. But other things that would, especially our transplants, our brassica families, our onion families, our allium families, and our solanaceae, which are tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, we're going to want to put a nice layer of compost. And it doesn't have to be thick. It can only be maybe 2 centimeters, 4 centimeters. It doesn't have to be a lot. Really, all it's for is to give that little boost of nitrogen that the plants are going to need so that they become nice and green and leafy. And we're going to talk about all about nutrients on another show. We can't unfortunately talk about everything at every show. So, but there you go. But the best way to do that is to start preparing your own veganic compost. On my Facebook page this morning, I posted a scan of my favorite design. And I have been composting since 1997. And I have tried all sorts of methods, and they have definitely not all worked. So this has been a trial and a half to get to what I feel now is my greatest creation. So I've tried bins, and I've tried, the first one I built was a 4-sided wooden structure with chicken wire around it that could open so I could move it and dump it from another side. Well, it was a 2x4 construction. Well, within about 2 years, the whole thing kind of decomposed, and then it just didn't work anyway. My next one was a 3-bin cement block system. And oh yeah, don't use cement blocks because cement blocks will suck moisture out. And really, I couldn't get anything composted except right in the middle. But then I had the fortunate opportunity to be able to kind of travel around the world, and especially in Central and South America, and even a little bit in Southeast Asia, I saw this. I saw how compost piles functioned, and the best piles I saw were just piled up in an out-of-the-way place and just left to their own devices. Now we're talking tropical countries, so they're quite humid, they're quite wet, they're probably losing some nutrients out of the compost, but things composted really fast. So that came up with the idea. When I was reading about composting also, I realized that people were really into this idea of layering. So I decided to try to work that in. And the very first year, and we bought the place here in 2014, and I started collecting my dry materials. And in 2015, I started my compost. And I created a system where you basically get to a flat place somewhere on your property. It doesn't have to be anywhere. It's out of the way. It can even be somewhat in the shade. That part doesn't really matter that much. And cross some twigs on the ground. You can make it whatever length you like. I like 5 feet. You can use 6 feet. You can use 4 feet. It really doesn't matter. But go ahead and lay some twigs crosswise so that you're creating a nice air layer. So that there's going to be air circulation, there's going to be like rodent circulation, there's going to be ground beetle circulation, there's going to be microorganisms at the bottom layer, on the layer of the surface of the soil that can end up working their way up also as the whole pile settles down. But go ahead and put those twigs. After that, you're going to put your green nitrogenous materials. These would be your high carbon to nitrogen ratio materials. So they're going to be your garden residues, kitchen waste, grass clippings. And when I say grass, I kind of more mean like native flora grasses. So if you live in the countryside and you cut your grass, there might be clover, and there might be horsetail and yarrow and things like that. Use that. But if you just have grass, if you just happen to have sod at your place, then yeah, cut that down, put that in your compost. It's a wonderful nitrogenous material. After that, I sprinkle a layer of native soil. And what the native soil does is it brings in the microorganisms that understand the native environment. So when you end up using that compost, it already understands and is assimilated. This is just my thinking, assimilated with the soil that your garden beds are. On top of that, you're going to put your brown carbonous materials. This can be straw, it can be dried hay, it can be chipped branch wood, it can be dry leaves. There's been a concern some places about if you use too many dry leaves, they could mat. We have maple leaves, which are very big, which do when I try to make what's called leaf mold. So I don't make leaf mold because it just doesn't make leaf mold unless I shredded the leaves. But if you put the dry leaves in there, it's fine. You can also put in all your dried material from the spring. So if you have like asparagus, if you have asparagus and you're cutting down the old asparagus, like they create kind of a stalk. If you put the asparagus stalk, the dried asparagus stalks in there, or the dried flower stalks, or whatever dried straw you have around, there's always dry material in the spring. It all works. And so once you have your greens and your native soil and your browns, and you continue with the process, you can go 2 high, you can go 3 high. It really depends on how much material that you have. But then after that, you're going to want to create kind of a dip in the middle, make it look like a volcano. And when you do that, then you can water. You can put in maybe 20 liters of water. You can put in 40 liters of water, whatever you think it'll hold. You really don't want the water to come squirting out the sides, but really at that point, if it's big enough, the water is just going to go. Whereas if you have a teepee pile, or if you have a flat pile, the water is just going to run off. But if you do that, all the water is going to get in. It's going to start warming up the pile. Then cover it with a recycled piece of clear plastic, and that will help the sun penetrate into the pile, really warm it up quickly. It will also germinate weed seeds. Or plant seeds or volunteer seeds. So if you happen to put maybe some flower stalks in there, or some coriander stalks in there, or happen to have some winter squash that was from the winter seeds in there, then they're going to germinate. And so actually some of my best winter squash have grown out of the compost pile. So you can either leave them and harvest them like I did last year, or it'll just create more green matter for your piles. After you cover it, leave it. Don't do anything for a month. Just leave it. And then after that, you're going to want to create another space with the twigs, and go ahead and take the top of the pile and put it onto the bottom, and keep doing that until you have your pile. After that point, you have your original twigs from your first pile. You can start your next pile. We always have 3 piles going, because I feel that if I have 3, if I do that process, the original process twice, so I've turned it, now it's covered again, and it sits a month, and then I go ahead and take it off and I turn it again, it sits a month. Within about 3 months, I have usable compost. It's what's called new compost. So it means it's still alive and it's still going to break down. It's still going to continue to break down. But but this is great because the microorganisms are going to still start using it. It's going to create a nitrogen boost. So things like your cucurbit family, your winter squash, your cucumbers, your zucchini, they really like this kind of compost. So if you want to side dress your plants, you can go ahead and put those on. So this is how you should make it. And I think this is important as anything else when we're talking about gardening. You really should be using all your food scraps. You should be using all the materials that you can that are around, that are regenerative. If there's anything in the world like to be called regenerative agriculture, this is the most regenerative thing that there is, and that is making veganic compost, because we're always going to eat, and we're always going to have food scraps, and the leaves are always going to fall, and grass is always, well, it doesn't always need to be cut, but there's always going to be dried materials. So really, there is always materials that are regenerative. So there you go, regenerative veganic compost. If you don't, if this isn't enough for you, then you can go think about purchasing either raw materials to make a bigger compost pile, like I did on a neighboring farm. We had chip branch wood delivered from the town because around here there's lots of trees that need to be cut around the power lines. Otherwise, they'll just down all the power lines. And then they put those into trucks, and then they usually take it off to the city yard. But a farmer friend of mine went ahead and had it delivered to his place. Then we had the idea, because his farm is located on an old hay farm, that we would cut the hay and we would make our own compost. So it was just chipped branch wood and green hay. And that was it. And then it was turned. Now, because the chipped branch wood has a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, about 70-1, and it's has quite a bunch of lignin in it. It's quite carbonous, but it's really more difficult to break down. It took longer. Instead of the 3 months with a kind of a veggie, like this kind of compost that I was talking about before, it took about a year. It was still not 100% broken down, but it worked really well. And by the time I put it in the fields, by the end of the season, I saw very little. And by the following year, I saw almost nothing left on the garden bed. So this is pretty cool. So if you don't have a lot of materials, or you want to make a bigger compost pile, you can go to your local nursery, you can go to your local garden center and ask them if they have chipped branch wood, dried straw, spoiled hay, whatever. And you can go ahead and make your own bigger compost piles. If you can't get around to doing that, because sometimes, and even us, we don't have a truck, so it's difficult for us to get this. And now that gas prices are so exorbitantly high, it could be expensive. The other thing you can think about is buying what's called veganic compost. Usually it's called live mulch. It's not called veganic compost. You just got to be careful when you're looking for it, because sometimes they do want to put some kind of animal manures in it. But live compost, the ones that I have found, and I've been able to find 2 suppliers, and my friend Jude over in Napierville, I just found him another 2 suppliers, or at least one. They use chip branch wood and like the town's grass clippings. And I think maybe they even use the green waste compost bins also. So there you go. So if you should make your own pile. If you have the space, make a bigger pile, look for the raw materials. And if you can't and you need to get some compost, because you really should have compost when you go ahead and start your garden, unless you've done your soil test and you find that your soil organic matter is really high, go ahead and look at your nursery or garden center, or sometimes like landscape companies. That's another good advice that my friend Megan up in Quebec City said. Look at landscape companies. Sometimes that they will have bulk drops of live mulch compost. Yeah, so that's that on compost. Going to go to a couple of questions, and if you have any other questions, go ahead and send them over. We're kind of in that phase now. Well, I guess we're always in that phase, but we're going to go ahead and talk another question. So I'm going to go back to garden preparation, and Jordan had a question, who is trying to do a no-till garden. And he said, I have so much couch grass in my system. I used to use a black plastic mulch that I would put on my beds and dig a hole into it and plant directly in that. And he's like, I just can't use it. I just can't do it, because that particular plastic is very thin. It ends up breaking down, even if they say it's a compostable material that's made out of plants. It ends up blowing all over the farm. I've had it. I used it 1 year, only 1 year here, because after that, I found that I just didn't like it. I didn't like the way the plants reacted. And 5 years later, I was still finding pieces of it in the ground. It just doesn't decompose. It's awful. Whereas the plastic tarp. So anyway, so the answer to this question, it wasn't just me who answered to this way. It was also many people that were on the forum. They said to tarp it, put the black plastic on it. You're not going to ever kill the native flora 100%. But what you are going to be able to do is you're going to be able to knock it back, solarize it enough that you're going to be able to go ahead and plant your seedlings, and they might be able to grow up faster than the native flora. So that was our answer to Jordan, and that's what I would recommend as far as getting that going. Now, a little bit about tillage and things like couchgrass or bindweed or anything with a long root system. If you have this in your system, a long root system where it puts up a lot of shoots and is very difficult to get rid of. When you till, you're going to just make up little pieces of say, this couchgrass or bindweed. And then you're going to have, instead of one long root, which really is not that difficult after a few years, to just go ahead and take your trowel, or we use what's called a hand hoe, or we use that 4-tine cultivator, and just kind of pull out the whole root. And it just comes right out after a while, because the soil is nice and loose, and it really doesn't want to live there. It would prefer to go live in the forest where I put it, or in the edge of the forest where I put it. It prefer to be there. So if you go ahead and till, you're going to create little pieces. There you go. You can see the problem. So this is the thing with tillage, and that's why you really don't want to do it all that much. Sometimes we have no choice here, and the cover crops that we have become way too expansive, and we use an annual clover, and they're even in the spring, after they died back in the fall and the snowpack, they're just there, and the roots are packed. Sometimes I'll need to, but it's extremely rare. Out of 160 beds in a season, I might till 6, maybe. And it really just depends. Again, it's all about observing the beds. So if you have big time native flora issues, or if you've had a garden before and it's been taken over by native flora, again, some people call it weeds, put that black tarp over it. You won't be disappointed. The other very interesting thing about this is that all of these native flora are what's called nutrient miners, because they're perennials. They can be dynamic accumulators, meaning that they're going to be able to pull up nutrients from the soil that your plants may not be able to access until they're very, very big. And and those nutrients will end up in the green shoots of the plant. So by composting them, you're going to have that available, maybe even very quickly available to the plants that are going to be growing there. So something else to think about. Very good question. I talked about hay mulch. Okay, so now this brings up probably the question of the day. This is by Matt in Toronto. Says, the other day I was working at a sanctuary, a farmed animal sanctuary, where he is starting, or they are starting a farm, and he was cleaning the pens where the pigs sleep. The pigs do not do their excrement where they sleep, and so the straw was quite clean, except there were a little bit of dry poop there. With this, can we use this and call ourselves veganic? What if the hay is not organic? Could we still call ourselves veganic? Okay, so let's start with, if hay is not organic. If hay is not organic, the thing you need to ask yourself is, what is the hay? If it's alfalfa, it's very possible that it is GMO. And if it's GMO, then it's absolutely not organic or veganic. You also need to ask yourself with hay if it was sprayed. Most hay fields, if they're native hay fields, are probably not. But it just depends. Sometimes farmers just go crazy and they spray. I don't know why, they just do. So this would have to be the question. So if you wanted to be able to use straw that wasn't labeled organic, hay that wasn't labeled organic, you would need to get a farmer attestation, the person who grew it, and have them attest to the fact that they didn't spray it and they didn't use GMO seed. That's it with straw. Now, can I use pig bedding to fertilize the fields? Because obviously it's an abundant resource. This is a huge question for sanctuaries. We're not entirely sure what other animal excrement is in that hay. Could they have peed in it? Could have another farmed animal come in, like a chicken or a duck? Could they have come over and peed or pooped in it? Unfortunately, no. And no, it wouldn't be veganic. It doesn't mean it shouldn't be used, and it doesn't mean you can't use it and call yourself a sanctuary fed farm. But to be called veganic, no. Really, I think veganic needs to be very clear that we're trying to create a system that does not use any animal manures or byproducts at all. Even if it's just a little, we're trying to create a system where just to show that we can absolutely end of exploitation of all animal agriculture. Now, sanctuaries obviously are not exploiting animals. We need sanctuaries going into the future. As we end animal agriculture, we need to have a place for the animals to list their lives. And comment came over, health risks also involved. Yeah, of course. You don't know what's in that straw. So the best thing, or what's in that hay. So the best thing to do with that hay is to go ahead and make a compost pile out of it. And the best solution, and I've thought about this a lot, and I've actually discussed this with sanctuary people a lot. I think the very best solution is that you use that compost or that hay that you're pulling out. We're going to go over about 3 minutes. So if you have to go, please go. But I'm just going to finish this thought. The best thing that we can do is we can make compost with it, feed it back to the lands that we are using to feed the animals. So if we have a hay field and we want to spread that composted bedding onto their hay field, then growing hay to be fed back to them, then this to me is about as closed loop as you can get, and it really is a perfect system. You can also use that compost if there's chickens on the sanctuary or goats on the sanctuary that need, say, corn, oats, and barley. You can use that compost to grow the crops that then go back and be fed to the animals. So to me, this is the absolute best solution, and it is my hope that sanctuaries have the opportunity to work with a farmer where they can get all of that bedding material, all that composting material, and give it to the crops that then go back to be fed to the animals. Again, closed loop and circular. So that is my answer to that question. That'll be a debate for a long time, but I value sanctuary people very much. I value sanctuary owners and all you lovely people that work at them, because without you, these animals would not be able to live. These animal beings would not be able to live their entire lives out there. So thank you for doing what you do. You're true heroes to the entire contingent of animal beings out there that are looking forward to hopefully staying with you soon. So that is all I have for tonight. Some coming events. If you're in my area at Val-David, Quebec, we have a seed festival because we're also a small scale seed company, La Ferme de l'Aube. We have a seed festival in Val-David, from 10 o'clock in the morning to 3:30 in the afternoon. This coming Saturday, the 19th. The next show for us is March 31st. We're going to be talking about as soon as the soil can be worked and season extension practices. If you ever have any questions in between, you can befriend me on Facebook, send me a question. You can, it's better to send it there, but if you send it here, I will see it also. I will answer your question. I'm here to help you as much as I can. So thank you. Have a wonderful couple of weeks. Have a happy spring upcoming. It's Sunday. It's very exciting. It's always such a blessed time. And I hope to see you next time. So peace and have a good rest of your night.